The land had been parched for years. The dust storms had swallowed everything: hope, crops, and even the skies. But in the dead of a relentless drought, Isaac Wells, with nothing but a sack of forbidden seed in his hands, knelt on the cracked earth, praying for a miracle no one believed in. Before we dive into this story, tell us where you're watching from, and if stories of perseverance against nature's wrath move you, hit subscribe. Tomorrow's story might just weather the storm like this one did. Isaac Wells knelt on the cracked earth of his farm, his rough hands trembling as he clutched the sack of seeds that could either be his salvation or his ruin. The small, round kernels were banned by the government. They were outlawed seeds, known to be capable of growing even in the harshest conditions, but they weren't sanctioned for planting in the heart of the Dust Bowl. The government had urged farmers to plant less, to leave the land fallow, to accept the creeps, drought as an act of God, beyond human control. But Isaac didn't believe in waiting for help that wasn't coming. He had seen too many of his neighbors pack up and leave, too many fields left barren under the scorching sun, but he refused to let his land become another empty, lifeless patch in a dying world. His father, a tough man who had taught Isaac everything he knew about survival in the unforgiving dirt, had often said, "You can't wait for a miracle. You make one." The dust storms came relentlessly every afternoon, swirling the life out of his fields, leaving behind only bare, white soil. It was as though the earth itself had been sucked dry of every last drop of hope. Isaac had stood by helplessly as each seed he'd planted the previous year turned to dust beneath the punishing winds. Yet in the quiet of his small barn, behind the closed door where only the shadows could see, Isaac had kept a secret. A neighbor had passed him the sack a month ago. "These seeds," the old man had whispered, "they might just make it. You can't grow anything else here, but these they'll fight through. Even the dust." Isaac had taken the seeds, a glimmer of hope amidst the despair that had consumed his farm. He didn't know if they would work, but it was his last chance. If it didn't, there would be nothing left to lose. With the heat of the afternoon sun bearing down on his back, Isaac opened the sack. The dusty grains spilled out onto his palm, smooth and almost too perfect. He could feel the weight of every decision, every hardship his family had endured, in the tiny seeds. His father's voice echoed in his mind again. "Make your own miracles, boy." Isaac stood up, brushing the dirt from his knees, and with a deep breath began to sow the seeds into the ground. One by one, they dropped into the earth, each falling as an act of rebellion against the land that had nearly killed him. For the first time in months, Isaac allowed himself to imagine the land coming back to life, just as the seeds promised. Days turned into weeks, and Isaac's hope began to wither like the last of his crops. The winds had yet to stop their endless howling dance, tearing at his house, his fences, and every inch of the land. Each day, Isaac would walk out to the field, kneeling again at the same patch of earth where he'd planted the forbidden seeds, watching, waiting. There was nothing, no green shoots, no signs of life. The dust had buried it all. In the evenings, Isaac's wife, Sarah, would sit quietly by the fire, the flicker of flames casting shadows on her weary face. She didn't say much anymore. It was as though the dust had drained the strength from her too. She hadn't smiled since the spring. Neither of them had. "Isaac," Sarah had said to him one night, her voice barely above a whisper, "are you sure about this? What if it's a fool's dream?" Her eyes were tired, too tired to hold on to hope any longer. Isaac looked at her, then, his heart heavy with the weight of their situation. "I'm sure. We can't let this land go to waste, Sarah. Not after everything we've fought for. We've got nothing left but this soil, these seeds." He motioned toward the window where the harsh winds continued to blow, carrying dust through every crack. The outside world had become a barren, lifeless expanse. But Isaac still held on to the belief that if he fought hard enough, nature would relent. That evening, after Sarah had fallen into a deep, exhausted sleep, Isaac went out to the field once more. The wind cut through his worn coat, the dust stinging his eyes. He knelt at the spot where he had planted the seeds, pressing his hands into the dry earth. The soil was hard, unforgiving. He could barely feel the tiny seeds beneath the surface. But then, something almost imperceptible shifted. A crack appeared in the soil. It was small, faint, but undeniable. Isaac's heart pounded in his chest. There, barely visible against the dry, cracked earth, was a tiny green sprout, the first sign of life. Isaac fell back, his hands on his knees, staring at the delicate green shoots emerging from the dust. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Enough to make him believe that maybe, just maybe, they would survive this. But the winds were still fierce, the storm was still coming, and the seeds were only the beginning. Isaac knew the battle had just begun. The storm came the next week, furious and unrelenting. The sky darkened as the wind picked up, howling across the prairie like a living beast. Isaac had heard rumors of a storm like this, something even worse than the usual dust clouds. The weathermen on the radio had warned of it, a storm that could carry dust from miles away, from states that weren't even in the path of the drought. It wasn't just a storm, it was a wall of dust, an unyielding mass of nature's fury. Isaac had watched the horizon that afternoon, the air heavy with the scent of dry earth and the promise of ruin. As the first gusts hit, Sarah rushed to the door, her face pale. She could feel the change in the air long before the storm arrived. "We need to get to the cellar," Sarah said, voice trembling. Isaac nodded, his eyes still fixed on the swelling clouds in the distance. The house was already shaking under the force of the winds, but Isaac couldn't tear his eyes away from the field. "The seeds, Sarah," he muttered, his throat tight. "I don't know if they'll make it." Sarah gripped his arm, pulling him away from the window. "Isaac, come on. It's not just the seeds, it's everything. We need to survive this storm first." They descended into the cellar, the wooden door groaning in protest as the wind pressed against it. Isaac had done everything he could to protect his family, but this storm, it was more than just a storm. It was a force that would strip the land bare, and no matter how hard he tried, Isaac couldn't stop it. In the dark of the cellar, Isaac sat against the wall, his hands trembling. He thought of the seeds buried in the soil, the fragile promise of life that had begun to take root. Would they survive the storm? Would the winds, strong enough to tear the roof from the house, destroy everything he had fought for? Outside, the storm raged for hours. The world above them turned to dust and wind, an unforgiving hell. They couldn't hear much beyond the howl of the wind, the occasional thud of a fallen branch, or a distant crash of debris. It wasn't until the storm finally passed, leaving a profound silence in its wake, that Isaac dared to leave the shelter of the cellar. When he stepped out into the dawn light, he was greeted with a landscape unrecognizable. The world was coated in dust, thick as fog. The sky had turned an eerie gray, and everything that once had life now appeared lifeless. Isaac's heart dropped as he scanned the field. It was impossible to tell if anything had survived. He rushed toward the spot where he had planted the seeds, fear gnawing at him with every step. His hands dug into the dirt, frantically searching, hoping for a sign. And then, through the dust, he saw it. A few tiny green shoots, just barely, but unmistakable. The seeds had made it through. The storm had ravaged the earth, but those small, forbidden seeds had fought on. Isaac fell to his knees, his breath coming in gasps, tears mingling with the dust on his face. They had made it. The land might still be barren, the storms might still come, but Isaac had witnessed something incredible, something that would change everything. Those seeds were a symbol of hope. They were a testament to survival in the face of destruction. Isaac looked up at the sky, a quiet defiance in his heart. It wasn't over, not yet. As the weeks passed, the small patch of green that had sprouted in Isaac's field slowly began to grow. It was a hard-earned victory. The winds still howled in the distance, and the dust storms still swept across the land, but every day Isaac could see that the little plants were not giving up. They stood firm, despite the constant pressure of the earth that had tried to swallow them. The land, however, was a constant reminder of how fragile that victory was. Isaac's neighbors had long since given up, selling their land or leaving for the cities, hoping for a better life in places where the earth still gave. The government had even offered buyouts, telling farmers like Isaac that the land was no longer viable, that it wasn't worth holding on to. But Isaac wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. He spent every morning working the land, carefully tending to the small crops that were emerging, watching them grow inch by inch. It wasn't just about the crops anymore. It was about proving that the land could still give life, that the soil could still heal. He kept working, digging in the dirt and planting, even when others mocked him for it. "Isaac, you're wasting your time," William Crawford said one day as he passed by Isaac's field. His face was worn, his voice heavy with years of disappointment. "The land's dead. You're just clinging to something that's already gone. It's just a matter of time before this dust swallows everything. Even if your crops grow, what'll they grow for? No one's buying crops around here. No one's even coming through." Isaac didn't respond. He knew that William was right in some ways, but he also knew something that William couldn't see. He'd seen the tiny green shoots. He'd seen life emerge from dust. And if that was all he had, it was enough. As the crops grew taller, Isaac's faith in them deepened. But so did the tension in the air. The dust storms had not stopped, they only seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. Isaac's resolve began to waver, especially as Sarah grew more anxious. The constant dust was taking its toll on her health, her breathing worsening with each storm. She had become quieter, more withdrawn, and Isaac could see the fear in her eyes, even when she tried to hide it. "It's only a matter of time," she said one evening as Isaac sat by the fire, his hands covered in dirt from the day's work. "Every time you go out there, you're betting everything we have. What if it's for nothing?" Isaac sat quietly for a moment, feeling the weight of her words. He had been betting everything, but he had no other choice. He couldn't let the land go, not after everything, not after the seed had sprouted. He couldn't give up on it now. "I'm not betting for nothing," he said quietly, meeting Sarah's tired eyes. "I'm betting that life is worth fighting for. If we don't keep trying, then what else is there?" Sarah didn't reply. She just watched him for a moment, her gaze softening. It was clear that the weight of the dust, the weight of their losses, was wearing her down. But Isaac knew one thing for certain: they couldn't leave. Not yet. Not while the land still fought back. The road ahead was long and uncertain, but Isaac, with his small patch of green life, was ready to see it through. The summer passed in a quiet struggle. The storms, while still frequent, seemed less fierce than before. Isaac had learned to read the signs, the way the wind shifted, the patterns in the dust, the way the land breathed under his boots. It was as if the earth had grown used to its own suffering and had made space for small victories. The crops that had once been fragile, barely clinging to life, were now robust and standing tall against the harsh sun. Isaac knew that if he could make it through the fall, if the harvest could survive the winter winds, it would prove everything. Not just the seeds, but everything he had fought for: his family's survival, his stubborn hope, and the unrelenting will of the land to keep going, even when everyone else had long since given up. One evening, Isaac stood at the edge of the field, his hands on his hips, watching the last of the daylight fade behind the dust-filled horizon. His eyes scanned the rows of plants' beanstalks that stretched upward, stubborn and proud, the green of life still hanging on in a world that had tried to take it all. Sarah came up behind him, her silhouette framed against the orange sky. "You think it'll be enough?" she asked quietly, her voice carrying the weight of all the questions she had kept buried in her heart. Isaac turned to her, his brow furrowed but a faint smile touching his lips. "I don't know, Sarah," he said, the honesty in his voice cutting through the quiet. "But I've seen enough to know that we can't stop now. Not when something's finally fighting back. Not when the land's giving us something to hold on to." Sarah didn't speak at first, but Isaac could feel the tension in her shoulders begin to ease, just a little. She had stood by him through everything, the dust, the heat, the doubt, but Isaac knew her resolve had begun to wear thin. It was the way she looked at their small cabin, the way she'd talk of moving east, of starting over in a town where there might still be something left to build. But in that moment, as they stood together on the edge of the field, he knew she felt it too, the pull of hope, the undeniable urge to believe that this time they might just make it. The next few weeks were the longest Isaac had known. Each day he went out into the field before dawn, praying the crops would endure, praying the soil wouldn't crack open and swallow them whole. Each evening, as the wind picked up and the sun dipped behind the horizon, Isaac's heart would race. He would run his fingers through the soil, his mind racing with the thought of failure, of loss, but each time the crops stood firm. They weren't perfect, but they were alive. Then came the day when Isaac, with hands weathered by toil and a heart brimming with fear and hope, stood in the middle of his field, looking at the beans that had grown so tall. It was harvest time. Isaac lowered himself to his knees, his hands trembling as he pulled the first bundle from the earth. The pods were plump, the beans inside full of life, proof that they had weathered the storm. The land had fought back, as he had hoped. It wasn't just survival anymore, it was proof of something much bigger. Isaac could hear the faint rumble of another dust storm in the distance, but for the first time in years, he didn't feel defeated. He glanced over his shoulder to where Sarah stood at the edge of the field, watching him. Her face was no longer clouded with doubt, but with something else, something softer. She gave him a small nod, a smile that didn't need words. Isaac's heart swelled with something he hadn't felt in a long time, hope, true and unbroken. As the wind howled in the distance, Isaac took the beans into his hands once more, this time with gratitude. Against all odds, they had done it, they had made it. And for the first time in years, Isaac knew they weren't just surviving, they were living.